So the news is finally out. LI.F.I has acquired Catalyst, and I have Jim here with me to kind of give like a behind-the-scenes view of this deal, right? So Jim, how does it feel? Did you ever think that we'll be working together in the same team?
No, never. So it's like it's pretty surreal, honestly, for it to all happen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we can get into the story, right? Like, how did the acquisition happen? When did you guys start talking? Because I know it was not a short process, but it wasn't also like a very, very long process. I guess give us a TLDR of like when did this happen? Like, how did the process start?
Yeah, so I guess we have to go back like a few years. So I would say, you and I have known each other for a few years at this point, and I've known some other folks in the team as well. And Philip was also an angel investor in the Catalyst. And so that was kind of the start of the relationship, pretty much, right? Where I knew that even from the outset of creating Catalyst, that aggregators like LI.F.I were going to be really important, and wanted to make sure that the cap table was constructed in a way such that Philip would always be interested in at least exploring partnerships with us, right? Irrespective of like what direction we ended up taking. And so that was a relationship that I've always had with him, and with, just like lightweight investor updates and just like casual conversations for the past 2.5 years. And of course, you and I have known each other as just like friends, right? And so in one of those kind of quarterly or even like biannual or semi-annually conversations with Philip, we kind of came to the existing conversation of always, oh, does it make sense to integrate Catalyst into LI.F.I routes, right? And this was probably our first conversation since we did the major strategic repositioning that we did back in October, where we went away from being a call it a bridge for EVM rollups to being a bridge for alt VMs, right? And instead of focusing on Ethereum or EVM as a virtual machine, we wanted to connect other chains that were being underserved in the bridge market that we felt like needed to be connected into, such that we can have a more holistic chain experience, right? Whether it be a chain abstracted experience or just a general, bridge experience. And I think after that strategic, pivot, Philip kind of saw a lot more strategic benefits for us to work together. Whereas before we were basically just another bridge that was going to compete with all the other bridges that LI.F.I was aggregating. And now we were much more of a complementary piece, right? We were deliberately trying to bring together bridges that had not been bridged together before, right? So on our roadmap, we're like move chains. We had integrated Bitcoin. We had our sights on TON and Tron and XRP, and quite frankly, just like a lot of random chains, right? For a lack of a better term. Sorry for all the other chain teams that are listening to this. um, and so that was of interest to LI.F.I, right?
Yeah.
And when we had this conversation, obviously the conversation of integration had always been on our minds. So we wanted to explore that. And after a few more conversations, at this point, it was beyond a quarterly meeting, right? It was more of a weekly meeting at this point. He kind of approached me with the offer of, hey, since this is such a complementary piece, it actually makes sense for you guys to just be a part of the LI.F.I team.
Mhm.
And at first I was pretty surprised. I was like, no, like get out of here. That shit's not going to happen. I like being a founder. I like owning my own roadmap. But after, I kind of put my ego aside and looked at it more logically, it made a lot of sense in a lot of different dimensions, which I can talk about in a second. And after a few more conversations, we met up in person at DevCon in Bangkok. I saw you. I saw countless members of the LI.F.I team. My co-founder Alexander met them. It made a lot of sense, and so we ended up meeting again in person in Berlin in December, and that was when the deal was basically finalized.
Yeah, I think, like you said, many things kind of came together to make this happen in a way. Like you pivoted to building this bridge for alt VMs, and at LI.F.I, we figured out EVM routes, we figured out like Solana routes, and our goal is always to be where like users want to be, right? So after EVM and Solana and like all of those common routes, alt VMs are the natural next progression. So in a way, there was like this perfect alignment there, and also the fact that you started taking the intense route, right? So the other thing is like we want to support solvers in our marketplace basically. So that was also like perfect alignment, and suddenly like the conversation started materializing more and more. So you mentioned that all of us met in Denver. So any like fun moments or like stories you remember from that particular conversation where something sparked where you were like, okay, this kind of makes sense.
Sorry, did you mean DevCon or
Oh
Denver?
shit, DefCon.
Okay, yeah, because we also I also had met people in Denver, but that was like a completely different thing. Um, but yeah, I met a lot of the team at DevCon. So I met various members of the engineering team, various members of the BD team, and it was awesome. Like it was cool to just like riff on certain things about the future of bridging, about just crypto broadly, about the deal. Everyone was really supportive and really open about it, right? I think there's always a weird dynamic when people learn that there's an ongoing deal and they try to really sell you, right? They're like, oh yeah, like everything's great, like you should come. But I felt like people at LI.FI were a lot more realistic. They're like, yeah, like this is broken, this is not great, but everything is trending in the right direction. And so I like that level of intellectual honesty in a team. I think also a really big fear of mine was just like the size of the team, right?
Mm,
Where Catalyst when we got acquired, it was 10 people, and LI.FI was much larger. And I had been in larger teams before in crypto, and knew that that wasn't really what I was looking for in an ideal situation. Mainly because not because of size alone. I don't think size is actually the issue. I think it's mainly because of the lack of crypto nativeness that I've observed in organizations that get a lot larger, right? And
mm,
so, the first crypto org that I worked at was at Ripple, and they are, I don't know what they currently are, but when I worked there, they were 400 to 500 people. And when you get to that size, there's no way everyone knows about crypto, right? It's just really hard to retain that level of interest and level of talent. And so that was certainly a fear. But after meeting so many people at DevCon and having really in-depth conversations with them about not only bridging, not only work related stuff, but also
mm.
just broadly things that are happening in crypto, like really really niche stuff, right? Like things that like happen on the timeline that day.
Yeah,
Like same day news cycles, like you kind of have to be really plugged into the to the
I think
information stream
that
that is CT.
that
Yeah.
kind of comes down to the culture that we have, right? Like even though it might seem like there are a lot of people, it's also because there are so many different teams kind of operating under the same house where everyone owns what they're doing, right? So like Jumper has their own team where they're all trying to figure out how to make this perfect UI for users, and the LI.FI team learns from that, works together, and like the entire team works on the API to make this possible. And the Catalyst team is like another part of the organization now where you guys have like full freedom to figure out intents and like that particular problem, like resource logs, how do people build chain abstracted experiences. So I feel like everybody has their niche and everyone kind of owns that vertical, which is why we're able to stay crypto native, even though we have like more people in the team.
Yeah, yeah. And that's helpful for sure. And I think that was really big signal for me that this was definitely the right move, right? Like I think the litmus test or rather the thought exercise that I deployed was if catalysts were this size, would it look similar? And the answer was yes.
Hmm. Makes sense. That's interesting. Like, did you have any one-on-one conversations with Philip where you were like, okay, this guy is thinking right, and it makes sense to kind of join forces, and we can actually just go out, be more ambitious, and win a lot more.
Yeah, I think I actually had a tweet about this last week where the more I've observed founders in crypto and also being a founder or having been a founder in crypto, kind of weird to say at this point. But the more I observe founders and I kind of like see their success patterns, I kind of become like a statistical model, right? Where it's like I see like different factors and what the success outcomes are. I think the more like insane you are, the better. Like genuinely. Uh, and I say this in the best possible way. Hi, Philip, if you're watching this after the fact, that Philip is insane in a good way, right? And my conversations with him just showed that the way that he views things is just on a very different wavelength than I think most founders view things. Where he wants to make bold moves, right? And I think the best founders make really, really bold moves. And this was a very bold move, right? There was certainly no need for Li.Fi to do this.
Mhm.
And he's the one that approached me, right? It wasn't even really on my radar, quite frankly. And so for him to approach me with this and with this really big kind of pitch of what we could do together, that was really, really insightful for me. And for me as a founder, first time founder, potentially aspiring serial founder, seeing Philip, who has also been, who is a serial founder and has had multiple other ventures, that is a lot of, I have a lot of learnings that I can take from him, right?
Mhm.
And I've already learned a lot from him about being bolder, about decision making, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was also something that was a really big green flag for me for the deal.
I mean, honestly, like it's also up to you to actually see it this way because a lot of people would, like you said, put their ego in front and be like, no, I want to be the founder. I'm the guy who calls the shots. So it's up to you to actually see it this way and take it in a positive way. And while you were saying that, like I've realized we've recorded one episode earlier, and even that was at a pivot moment for you, right? So we've really had, we've really covered only the biggest catalyst moves in the last 6 months while having
Yeah.
conversations.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's what podcasts are for, right? You don't want to be talking when it's small beans.
Yeah, I mean, like with the other people, you can also just talk about like a new integration or like some new product or something. But I feel like we've always had this one-on-one, relatively deeper personal conversation, which is also a nice thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always try to have only big news for you. That's my MO.
Okay, so you guys were building the bridge for alt VMs, right? I don't think that changes in a way of like the vision that we have right now. But what are you most excited to do in the next 6 months?
So yeah, and this actually is a good tie-in to kind of like your previous question about, or like a comment that you had about founders having too much ego to kind of see the bigger picture. So for me, I think what's really exciting about the next 6 months is just, well, I think it's two things. One is just doing right by the product. And the second thing is solving interoperability, which is obviously a big one. And so what do I mean by doing right by the product? And so I think there are a few different types of founders. So there are founders who are founders because they like being founders, right? Like they like being entrepreneurs, they like being the boss, they like the autonomy. That's perfectly fine, right? I also enjoyed that. There are founders who are founders because they like the product, right? Or they like, or said differently, they like the problem,
Mhm.
and the product is just a function of the problem, right? And I would say that I'm on that bucket. And just for the sake of just being complete, there are also founders who are founders because they like being leaders, right? They don't necessarily need to be founders. It's just easier than working up a corporate ladder and managing a team, right? And I also like managing a team for what it's
Mhm.
worth. I think those are all valid reasons to be founders. But for me, I'm a founder because I really like the problem, right? I really like solving interoperability. And I think the product that we came up with is a really, really good product, quite frankly.
Mhm.
And what Alexander and I talked about when we were going through this deal was basically what kind of founders are we, right? Because what kind of founder we are really informs whether we go through with this deal or not, right? Because coming out of it, we're not going to be founders anymore. We're going to have something else. And when we both agreed that we were founders because we wanted to solve a problem and that we were basically servants to our product, then we want what's best for our product. And we knew in our hearts that what was best for the product was to join Li.Fi, because joining Li.Fi allows Catalyst, the product, to have as much order flow as possible, as quickly as possible,
Mhm.
right? And so Li.Fi moves billions of dollars of volume. Having that flow through, at least a portion of that flow through Catalyst, would be a far better. It would not only be more volume than we have ever seen through Catalyst through our own means. It would not only be a higher potential to get more volume over time, it would also be the quickest way to get it, right? Like effectively overnight, we are funneling at least a fraction of these billions of dollars of volume into our product.
Mhm.
Whereas we probably would have had to fight tooth and nail to get the equivalent amount over many years, right? And so it was basically just like a step function jump for us, right? Like an acceleration point for the product. And so for us to not be founders anymore, but to still be servants of the product, that is ultimately what we wanted to do, right? And so that's what we're excited about. We're excited about building more or less the same thing, but just under the LI.Fi umbrella and having it reach the potential that we think it could reach from a distribution perspective. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to solve interop, right? And that's kind of a loaded term because I think there's a few problems in interop, but I think the biggest problem that we have right now is actually not chain abstraction. It's just connectivity, right? It's when we like I think chain abstraction will happen. I quite frankly think like it's a pretty trivial problem to solve. Sure, there's like standards and maybe some chain upgrades that need to happen, but I still think it's like relatively doable and trivial. I think what's a much harder problem, and we've seen that play out in the last 2-3 years, is actually connectivity. How do we connect all the chains that are coming online every day, right? It's become incredibly trivial to launch a new chain, and we still don't have the infrastructure in place to connect them all together. And no project has really come on board and actually tried to solve that problem, right? And so I think by LI.Fi and Catalyst combining forces, we're actually able to solve that. We're building the necessary infrastructure in order for any chain that comes online to automatically be connected to every other chain in the LI.Fi network, so to speak. And I can talk about that more in a second about how we're doing that. But I think it's well within reach of what we can do. And that's going to solve a huge problem. And then, we let the chain abstraction people do the abstracting.
Yeah, I mean, for something like chain abstraction to actually succeed, you need connectivity with all the chains. You need to have all the endpoints deployed. You need to have liquidity between chains so that something like chain abstraction can actually flourish later on. Your first point about like you and Alexander just being product founders, when you were saying that, I was thinking about how did I get to know about Jim for the first time, and it was actually your blog post on bridging, right? Like the title was "What do I talk about when I talk about bridging?" or something like that. So
Yeah.
so it
It
was like
was
you
very long and confusing.
actually care about bridging and interop, and not since like the last year or something. It's been a 3-year journey, and even before you launched Catalyst, you approached interop as like a subject of like interest to you. So that was nice. And then even when I talk to Alexander every time, like he just smiles about thinking about the product, and he has a very like
Yeah.
childlike smile, thinking and just talking about the product, which I've not seen in too many people, and I love the fact about that. Like he's just so happy building the best product possible to actually make or like to actually solve interop.
Yeah. And that's what I love about Alexander, honestly. Like everything that people say about me about interop, right? Like being very well versed on it and forward thinking. I just steal it from him, quite frankly. Like he's certainly more of a behind the scenes person. I just package it up with a nice bow on top and make sure that everyone can understand it with very very small words.
Yeah, I mean, all of us have our role, and you do a really good job at it. So, like, maybe before we wrap this up, you want to talk about how we're solving that. So, next week, we're also publishing a whole piece on all the different parts of the stack. So, maybe you want to set it up how we're going to solve this problem of interop.
Yeah, so I haven't formed the right framework of how to think about this yet. Hopefully, the next time I'm on the pod, I'll have a much clearer answer for you uh, on how we're trying to solve this. But basically, I think the right way to paint this is through the perspective of a chain, right?
Mm.
And this is always the perspective that I've been taking since I started Catalyst 2.5 years ago, where if you are a new chain and you're launching a new chain, what are you going to do afterwards, right? Like, how are you actually going to onboard people? And that's a really hard problem to solve, right? Because it's actually a lot of different things that need to come together in order for that to happen. And this was a problem, 3 years ago when I was at Aave, looking at POCs for what, Aave chain or, Lens chain or what have you would look like, which, it's very timely now given that it's going to launch this year. But it's still very prescient now, right? And a lot of RAS projects, they've done really good jobs to try to add a bunch of things that chains need. Not only do they have RPCs, some of them even have oracles and data indexing and embedded wallets, et cetera, et cetera. Bridging is still pretty elusive, right? And connectivity is incredibly important. And it needs to be as seamless as possible. And like I said, this is always a problem that I've been looking at Catalyst. And I think the product that we've been building at Catalyst has evolved in order to solve that problem based on, the problem changing on certain requirements from a user perspective and obviously market conditions as well. And so as it stands right now, effectively what a new chain needs to be connected to a wider network of chains is a solver, some sort of, oh, hold on, I haven't shown my hands, a solver, some sort of liquidity, right? A solver, liquidity, and some sort of, call it settlement, all right? And I'll talk more about what I mean by that, because obviously that's a confusing and loaded term. And so from a solver's perspective, there are not a lot of solvers out there, right? Like, candidly, when we built Catalyst and we pivoted or we evolved, whatever term you want to use, to an intent-based mechanism, onboarding solvers is incredibly hard because it's a pretty laborious effort, especially when you have to, go to a brand new chain that lacks all the things I just mentioned, right? Good data indexing, good RPCs, et cetera. So their threshold for APRs is actually incredibly high. And it's really hard to onboard them. And you kind of have like third-party risks, right? It's like they have totally different agendas. They could not do it last minute, right? Even though you sign SLAs and stuff like that. Look at me working in crypto and talking about, legal contracts. And so that's really hard, right? And certainly every team could, every bridging team can make their own solver, pending, legal clarity and whatnot. But I want to make it so that anyone can run a solver. And so we're basically building a solver as a service system, right? And we call that Pioneer. I don't know if I'm allowed to share that. Feel free to cut it if I'm not allowed to share that. So that's the first piece. On the liquidity side, I think liquidity has been by far the hardest problem that we've encountered at Catalyst. When we had our AMM mechanism, it was designed exactly to solve the problem that I just talked about, to connect all these millions of chains within a day, for all these new chains to be interconnected. Liquidity was always the problem, right? How do you have enough liquidity on both sides of the route, on this new chain to whatever other chain I want to connect to, or maybe it's a hub, or maybe it's something like Base. Where are you getting that money, right? These chain teams are not flush with cash, at least in the very, very long tail. And even if they were, why would they deposit in some random AMM contract, right? And so that was a really hard issue. And I think an intent-based system kind of solves that issue, but I think we can do more with that, right? And so there's two things that we're doing to solve that. One is that with Pioneer, not only do you have solver as a service, you have liquidity as a service. And so you can move your liquidity to be used for solving. And so you can run a solver without any inventory and use someone else's liquidity, and then basically split the fees, right? Which I think there will be a lot of, given how profitable solvers are. The second thing is that we have a partnership with Glacis Labs, and we've created something called, or rather they've created something called Airlift, which is a cross-chain token standard aggregator. And so you don't, quite frankly, even need liquidity on this new chain. You can just mint and burn it from another chain. And you can use something like an OFT standard to bring over Tether or virtuals or story or whatever OFT you want, or any other token standard, right? Or if there's no token standard, you can do something like hyperlane warp routes if you really want to. So that's the second thing. And then lastly is settlement. And that's where Catalyst, or rather new Catalyst, comes in, where at the end of the day, there needs to be a way for these solvers to, well, settlement means a lot of things, right? Well, one thing is like there needs to be a way to actually monitor all the intents that are being expressed throughout all these chains and match them to various solvers. And then afterwards, after the solvers have effectively lent their inventory to these users for their intents, they obviously need to be paid back by the user's funds, right? And so that's kind of called settlement, I guess. Some people call it maybe verification. That's where Catalyst comes in, where you need to have some layer of not only intent solver order matching, but also the verification and reimbursement on the solver side. And so Catalyst can do that. And it can do that in an incredibly scalable way such that any new chain can leverage it off the bat, right? So that's one part of it. And the second part of it, sorry, this very long answer, is on the inventory rebalancing. And so, of course, if you have solver as a service, a big part about being a solver, a big pain, or rather a hurdle, is how to effectively rebalance inventory, right? Because if you can do that very effectively, obviously your quote's gonna be a lot more competitive. And so we are allowing for solvers, especially brand new solvers that are using the solver as a service, to not think about that and just hold inventory in one chain and just solve on that single chain.
Mm.
And that is also what Catalyst will be doing as well. New Catalyst.
Awesome. I think like that was a very long answer. There's a lot of details there, and the best part is like there's so much more that you could have said. Like the fact that you can literally use any bridge, any oracle for the verification part, and how you've built the system to be like extensible to any virtual machine. So I'm very excited to actually publish like this new article on Catalyst, Li.Fi 2.0, and how everything fits together, and hopefully with that out, people will have a much better picture of like how everything comes together, how Li.Fi will evolve, how Catalyst actually unlocks some of these like new markets, and also like unlocks chain abstraction through resource logs, intents, and everything. So I'm very excited, and I hope you are too.
Yeah. I think the beauty of this is like it was not like a afterthought, right?
Mhm.
It was not like, oh, let's acquire this team and have them like fuck
Figure
around
it
and
out.
find out. Yeah. No, it was very, very intentional. And I think the vision that Philip pitched me was pretty high level, but was directionally around that, right? And I think since we've joined, it has kind of evolved into something much clearer, which is really awesome. And like you said, like we haven't even talked about resource locks yet or chain abstraction. We haven't even
Mm.
talked about like modular verification, stuff like that, or how Catalyst is even able to do verification for a brand new chain if there's no, if there's no like infrastructure around it, if there's no like layer zero or another messaging protocol, like how does that happen? Yeah, things get, yeah, it gets really deep, but I think that's a testament to how deeply we've thought about this, right? Like this is not an afterthought. Just to circle back to my original comment.
Yeah, and honestly, like really excited for shipping some of these things over the next 6 months because, like you said, the thesis becomes clearer and clearer. The parts of the stack become clearer, and now we just have to actually ship these things, take them to market, and help teams build actually useful experiences, products on top. And we're seeing good interest. Like you guys are working with some teams to figure out how to actually design some of these stacks, which I feel like is super helpful because the customer always demands certain features, right? So that's the most interesting bit of it, like solving a new problem in a way.
Yeah. Luckily, I think that's a very doable thing to execute. I know it's like a platitude to say like, oh, this is a good idea, like, but the most important thing is execution, right? I I agree. Like, I don't disagree. Um, I'd like to think that like I'm pretty good at executing, and I've had a lot of proof points in my career that like I can actually like ship. Um, so I'm not super worried about that. I would just be more worried if we're building the right thing, quite frankly.
Mm,
But that's where we have to keep our ear to the ground and figure it out.
makes sense. Thanks a lot for doing this. I'm super excited, and I hope everyone who is listening to this gets a better picture of what's going on at Li.Fi and what's ahead. And honestly, like looking forward to working with you and also shipping some cool stuff over the next year.
Looking forward to working with you too, man.